Over the Pacific, American pilots believed they understood air combat until a pale-winged shape rose from the ocean haze. Faster, sharper, impossibly agile. Within minutes, entire formations vanished, and the survivors sent back a message that stunned U.S. commanders. We're facing something we've never seen before. For most of the 1930s, American military intelligence viewed Japanese aviation through a narrow and deeply flawed lens. Reports from attachés in China and Manchuria were read, catalogued, and ultimately dismissed. The consensus in Washington was unwavering. Japan lacked the heavy industry, high-grade alloys, and engine manufacturing capability to produce a first-class fighter. American analysts wrote confidently that Japanese aircraft were lightly built, derivative machines, suitable only for border patrol. Others went further, suggesting the Imperial Japanese Navy relied on little more than copies of outdated Western designs. This assumption became doctrine. It seeped into flight schools, intelligence briefings, and the quiet conversations of senior officers who believed that if war ever came, American fighters, rugged, fast, and well-armored, would easily control the Pacific skies. But beyond American sight, inside the workshops of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, a different reality was taking shape. Engineers under Jiro Horikoshi had been perfecting a design unlike anything the West expected. Their creation, the A6M0, was a contradiction to every American assumption. Astonishingly light due to aggressive weight saving, capable of a 1,600-mile combat radius, and agile enough to outturn nearly anything in the world. Yet in 1941, almost no U.S. pilot had ever heard its name, let alone seen its silhouette. In the days before Pearl Harbor, American airfields across the Pacific carried an air of routine confidence. At Clark Field in the Philippines, on the sand-blown runways of Wake Island, and aboard U.S. carriers patrolling near Oahu, pilots rehearsed familiar maneuvers. They practiced diving attacks against mock targets, dogfights against each other, and formation flights in the dependable but aging P-36 and P-40. Their training emphasized meeting an enemy that was presumed slower, less coordinated, and technologically behind. Among these airmen was the kind of pilot found on nearly every field, young, eager, and shaped by the doctrines of the era. Men like Lieutenant Tom Gaines, not a famous ace or historical figure, but emblematic of hundreds of pursuit pilots who had never fought a modern air war. Gaines' world was defined by the aircraft he knew, the intelligence he trusted, and the belief that American engineering superiority was unquestionable. He had never been briefed on an aircraft with the Zero's performance, because no such briefing existed. Yet fragments of warning were beginning to appear. Radio intercept units from Hawaii to Corregidor picked up encrypted bursts of Japanese aviation traffic. Reconnaissance hinted at increased fighter deployments in Formosa and the Marshalls. Still, most commanders waved it aside. If Japan committed fighters to battle, the assumption held they would be slow, fragile, and no match for American pursuit planes. Then came the morning that rewrote all expectations. Just after dawn, pilots scrambled to their cockpits as dark specks rose over the horizon fast, climbing effortlessly, turning with uncanny precision. And as American fighters raced upward to meet them, one realization settled in with chilling clarity. They were facing something they had never even heard the name of. The first American encounters with the Mitsubishi A6M0 came not as organized duels between equals, but as sudden, disorienting shocks in the opening hours of the Pacific War. December 1940, one unfolded in a blur of alarms and rising columns of smoke. Across Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the jungles of Malaya, pilots scrambled into cockpits with no sense that the enemy fighter diving toward them represented an entirely new era of aerial combat. At Pearl Harbor, as the second wave approached, the black silhouettes of Japanese carrier aircraft cut across the sky with impossible precision. Among them were the long-winged Zeros, skimming the clouds before rolling into steep diving attacks. Witnesses later recalled the moment American fighters attempted to intercept. A P-40 pilot described how the Zero went straight up like an elevator, climbing at an angle no American aircraft of the time could match. Others remembered how it spiraled tightly, sun glinting off its pale fuselage as it inverted and slipped behind them in seconds. In the Philippines, where the Far East Air Force scrambled desperately from Clark and Nichols fields, the mismatch became brutally clear. Pilots tried the maneuvers they'd practiced countless times in training, wide pursuit turns, climbing rolls, low-speed scissors, only to find themselves outmatched at every step. One American flyer later said simply, "I couldn't stay on his tail longer than 3 seconds." Another described it as fighting a ghost, a machine that seemed to vanish and reappear faster than any instinct could follow. The technical imbalance was undeniable. The P-40 Warhawk, America's primary frontline fighter in Asia, was tough and reasonably fast in a dive. But it was heavier by design, with armor plating and self-sealing tanks that the Zero lacked. In a climbing fight or a low-speed turn, it was outclassed. The Zero could haul itself into blisteringly tight circles, sustaining turns that American doctrine insisted were impossible for any fighter. The first micro-stories of catastrophe spread across every airfield. At Clark Field, a pilot attempted a standard pursuit turn, the same maneuver he had flown against P-36s dozens of times. His Warhawk stalled almost immediately, dropping into the path of cannon fire that shredded his trailing edge. He never stood a chance. In Malaya, 2 Allied pilots believed they were chasing a damaged Zero, watching it wobble slightly at the top of a climb. Then, without warning, the Japanese fighter flipped vertically, shot skyward, and left both pursuers hanging helplessly in the air. Even experience offered little protection. In the Philippines, a squadron leader ordered his men to outturn the attackers, relying on the pre-war assumption that Japanese aircraft were slow and fragile. He initiated the maneuver first, and within moments, his P-40 was stitched with 20 rounds. His aircraft crashed in a field outside of Manila. His surviving pilots never again trusted the manuals written in the 1930s. Fear seeped into the after-action reports. Pilots spoke of hearing bullets before seeing the Zero that fired them. Others admitted they never saw it coming, as the Japanese fighters materialized from above or behind, always seeming one step ahead. But amid the smoke, the wreckage, and the staggering losses, something else began to appear. A pattern, a weakness, a clue that the Zero was not invincible if anyone survived long enough to recognize it. The first weeks of war were defined by shock and loss. But out of that chaos, a new clarity began to rise, forged not in classrooms or pre-war doctrine, but in the desperate experience of the men who survived their first encounters with the Zero. On airstrips from Luzon to northern Australia, pilots gathered around dented fuselages and scorched engine cowlings, trading the only truths that mattered now. Don't turn with them, you'll die. Dive, always dive. Use your weight, make it fight your fight. These warnings spread faster than any official directive. They were fragments of survival, raw, unfiltered, and utterly at odds with everything American pursuit pilots had been taught. What many didn't realize at first was that someone had predicted this disaster years before the first Zero appeared over Pearl Harbor. Claire Lee Chennault, the former U.S. Army Air Corps officer who trained the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, in China, had spent the late 1930s studying Japanese aviation with almost obsessive precision. He observed Japanese fighters' extreme maneuverability, their lightweight frames, their ability to climb sharply and turn inside almost any Western aircraft. His reports warned Washington in plain terms. If American pilots tried to fight Japanese fighters in traditional turning engagements, they would be slaughtered. His warnings were dismissed as exaggerations. Now, in December 1941, and the months that followed, Chennault's long-ignored analysis became gospel. Surviving U.S., Australian, British and Dutch pilots began to embrace the tactics he had drilled into the Flying Tigers. Use superior diving speed. Fight vertically, not horizontally. Make slashing attacks, fire once, then climb away before the Zero can turn. Never, under any circumstances, engage in a prolonged dogfight. Where the Zero was light, the P-40 and F-4F Wildcat were heavy, with strong airframes that could dive at speeds Japanese pilots dared not follow. A Zero attempting a steep, high-speed chase risked compressibility and control loss. It was the first real weakness American pilots could exploit. Small moments of survival became turning points. In New Guinea, a P-40 pilot later recalled clinging to a single line from a pre-deployment briefing. The P-40 is a rock, treat it like one. When a Zero slipped behind him in a tightening spiral, he resisted the instinct to turn. Instead, he shoved the nose down and let gravity take over, diving so hard that his controls stiffened and the wings shuddered. The Zero broke off. It simply couldn't follow. He reached home shaken, but alive, and with a newfound understanding of how to fight an enemy built for agility, not endurance. By early 1942, the first confirmed American victories against Zeros were not products of superior skill, but of discipline and adaptation. Pilots who respected the new rules survived. Those who ignored them joined the smoking wrecks scattered across the Pacific. Slowly, painfully, the lessons spread. From the carriers of the Coral Sea to the battered airstrips of Guadalcanal, pilots radioed back their field-learned wisdom. Hit once, climb away, never turn. Against all odds, American aviators were beginning to write a new rulebook, one dogfight at a time. The Zero's early victories had carved a legend across the Pacific, a myth of invincibility built from the wreckage of Allied aircraft scattered across Malaya, the Philippines, and the Coral Sea. But myths, like aircraft, eventually reveal their seams. And by mid-1942, after hundreds of engagements, American pilots began to see the Zero not as a supernatural predator, but as an engineering compromise. The first revelation came from the aftermath of dogfights. Wrecked Zeros, when found intact enough to study, stunned American ground crews. There was no armor plating around the cockpit, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The structure, built from an ultralight aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, could twist and bend with remarkable resilience, but it offered almost no protection. A Zero's unmatched agility, long range, and jaw-dropping climb rate came at a cost: extreme fragility. Pilots, once terrified by its acrobatics, were the first to notice. Reports from Guadalcanal and New Guinea repeated the same observation. One burst and it went up like paper. Hit the fuel lines, they bleed gas and burn fast. The realization was unsettling. The Zero had never been a super machine. It had been designed around Japan's strategic needs: long-distance reach over the Pacific, quick reaction speed, and precision maneuvering. Protection for the aircraft or its pilot had been sacrificed entirely. With this knowledge, fear slowly gave way to something else: confidence. When American fighters attacked from above, using boom and zoom tactics, the Zero's weaknesses were brutally exposed. Its light frame couldn't withstand sustained fire. Its tanks ignited with horrifying ease. But this shift brought its own emotional weight. Pilots wrote in their diaries about the unease that followed these victories. Many Japanese aviators never escaped their burning aircraft. The design that gave them superiority in the early months also robbed them of a chance to survive when tables turned. The enemy that once seemed untouchable now appeared tragically vulnerable and human. Still, knowledge alone wouldn't win the air war. A tactical edge was emerging, but the Zero remained deadly when fought on its terms. The tide would not truly turn until a new American fighter entered the stage, one built not merely to withstand the Zero, but to dominate it. By 1943, the Pacific War had reached a decisive phase in the air. The lessons of 1941 and 1942, lessons paid for in blood, had been etched into every briefing, every tactical manual, and most importantly, into the design of America's newest fighters. The F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair were no accident. They were the culmination of meticulous study of the Mitsubishi Zero, built around one principle: survive, dominate, and exploit every weakness of an enemy that had once seemed invincible. The Hellcat, designed by Grumman, combined a powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine with heavy armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Its roll, rate, and climb were tailored to counter the Zero's famed agility. The Corsair, built by Vought, carried a massive punch, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, reinforced wings, and unmatched speed in a dive. Both aircraft traded some agility for survivability, but they were faster in vertical engagements, stronger in sustained fire, and built to exploit the very vulnerabilities American pilots had identified over the Philippines, Guadalcanal, and New Guinea. The transformation in the air was audible. Radio chatter that once echoed panic and desperation, "They're turning, keep the dive," was replaced with confident commands. "We own the altitude now. Let's finish it." Pilots no longer approached dogfights with fear. They approached with calculated aggression. They could climb above, dive past, and fire with the certainty that their aircraft would take punishment and return them home. The Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 crystallized the shift. Over Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, U.S. Navy and Marine aviators engaged hundreds of Japanese aircraft attempting to intercept the invasion fleet. Over 300 enemy planes were destroyed in a single day, a testament to superior aircraft, refined tactics, and the painful wisdom gleaned from the years when Zeros had seemed untouchable. But the victories came on the shoulders of those who had learned the hard way. The pilots who had faced the Zero in 1941-42, many of them never returning, left behind a blueprint for survival. Their mistakes, reports, and observations informed every maneuver, every training exercise, and every engineering decision. The Hellcat and Corsair were the physical embodiment of their experience, machines shaped by knowledge bought at the highest cost. The Zero dominated the Pacific for 6 months. Its myth endured, but its legend was ultimately written by the men who faced it first and survived long enough to tell the world what they saw.